and welcome to Hanover's webcast on the topic of finding and inspiring the next generation of business leaders. My name is Andrew Watson. I am a senior consultant here at Hanover and will be your facilitator for the event. By way of introduction, I'm one of Hanover's experts in executive search for leadership roles in technology and sales positions. To kick things off, here are a few housekeeping points. Number one is timings. We'll aim to finish the main part of the session by about 11:30, but if the question and answer section is going well, clearly we'll continue for a short time afterwards. Number two, for the Zoom call, everyone is set up on mute apart from the key speakers. So if you have a question or comment, please write this in the chat box within the Zoom application. I'll be monitoring this and we'll be able to present some of your questions to the speakers later on. Thirdly, the event itself is being recorded and will be available afterwards for you to download and to share. And finally, on the housekeeping side, the event is split into three sections. We've got a 10-minute presentation by our guest speaker, General Paul Nanson, and then focused Q&A between General Nanson and Richard Waddell, who is Head of Leadership Solutions here at Hanover. Then thirdly, there'll be a general Q&A with your questions. And as stated, please submit these questions via the Zoom chat room function. I can't guarantee that all questions raised in the event will be answered, but we'll try and always follow up if needs be afterwards. Now, for those who don't know Hanover, please forgive the little puff piece now. Hanover is a global provider of talent solutions with 25 years experience in three distinct lines of business. We do executive search, that's helping organizations find business leaders and subject matter experts. Secondly, our leadership consulting business under Richard Waddell helps organizations increase their performance and fulfill the potential of their leaders and teams. And thirdly, we have a market intelligence capability which provides actionable insights on things such as salary benchmarking or forensic assessments of competitor talent. Our head office is in London and we have locations across East and West Coast USA, Europe and Asia. So put simply, Hanover's expertise is in helping clients find the best people and to help them maximize their potential. Now, we're not an events company, so we run these sessions primarily to share knowledge, but also to build brand and engage with clients. So please forgive us in advance if we approach you afterwards to make inquiries about how we might be able to help you or your organization with our talent solutions. Thank you again. That's the formalities over. I'll now hand you over to your main host for today, Richard Waddell, who is Head of Hanover Leadership Solutions.
Andrew, thank you very much. So as Andrew mentioned, I run Hanover Leadership Solutions, and what that means is we provide leadership and talent management consulting for Hanover's clients. So in practice, we support executive search through psychometrics and leadership assessment to help clients select and onboard outstanding leaders. But we also help clients to identify and develop leaders already in their businesses. So this is also focusing on increasing team effectiveness and planning succession, particularly for senior roles. So part of our conversations with clients always includes how to get the best out of and how to lead Generation Z, which is why it's a particularly relevant topic for us and our clients. In terms of my own background, so I trained at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and I spent 15 years as a regular and reserve British Army officer, including time in Iraq, Cyprus, the United Nations and Afghanistan. I then moved into leadership consulting with a company called Hay Group, and then subsequently ran my own business before joining Hanover about 2 years ago. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker for today, Major General retired Paul Nanson. We're very honoured to be joined by Paul today, and that Paul is giving up his time to share his insights with us. Paul served for 34 years in the British Army, and this included numerous leadership roles on pretty much every continent. And for the past 5 years, Paul has been Commandant of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which is considered the world's premier leadership academy. And he's also at the same time been Director Leadership for the British Army. So Paul has led the process of taking Generation Z civilians and developing them into military leaders. And he's also played a significant commercial role in the Army's relationship with Capita, resulting in the best recruiting performance in 10 years. To capture his experiences, Paul recently wrote a book called Stand Up Straight, and this is about Sandhurst and how they select and develop up and coming leaders. And the book's now a Sunday Times bestseller, and all proceeds from it go towards Sandhurst. So I'm going to hand over to Paul, and Paul, very much looking forward to hearing your insights and experiences.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everybody. It is a huge privilege to be with you this morning and to be able to talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart and has been for a while now. Now, I realise leading Generation Z is quite a controversial topic. I know how dangerous it is to stereotype any group, and why, given that all generations are unique, why do we want to single this one out for special attention? Well, my credentials for doing so are definitely not science-based. Those of you who know me know I'm not a scientist, but my observations are built on the last 5 years at Sandhurst, watching cadets come through, but perhaps more importantly, seeing how we have had to change, adapt the way we develop, nurture, and lead them in order to get the best out of their considerable potential. And I think given they represent your current crop of leaders or your next generation of leaders, my short talk is designed to offer some thoughts and insights and to get the debate going for the conversation afterwards. Slide, please, Jess. So really first, I thought I'd kick off with a few observations on Generation Z in terms of my own experience. As you'll know, they are a generation born after 1995. And I think they're different mainly because they are the first generation born into digitization. They do not know a world without social media or smartphones. And therefore they are more connected or better connected, more collaborative than perhaps any generation gone before. They have these vast social networks of friends, but whilst these friends are there, they are really little more than connections, you could argue. And therefore, in terms of physical teams, they haven't experienced perhaps as much the cohesion that comes with more traditional activities such as, competitive sports. Playing Fortnite or Call of Duty is not quite the same. And better connected means that they have access to huge amounts of information, at the touch of a button. They crave the certainty of an immediate response and often take that response as being the right information to answer a particular issue or challenge. And as a consequence, they sometimes rush to make a decision or sometimes wait too long to make a decision, waiting for that extra piece of information. And as a result of being able to click a button, they sometimes live and think in the immediate and don't give quite as much space to considering some of the wider implications, some of the macro reasons behind life or their own personal behavior. So sometimes a general lack of self-awareness. But this is a generation that really does want to make a difference. They want to make their families proud of them. They like structure, want purpose, and they want to do something that matters. And they genuinely do want to be part of the conversation. So it's not that they aren't interested in the big picture. It's just sometimes they don't have the time to think about it. And we found that actually quite a few of them have a fear of failure. Again, not because they are weak, but because they haven't been allowed to fail before they get to Sandhurst. Or if they have, it's been seen as a real negative. And then finally, because they are perhaps so heavily marketed, particularly in social media, we found that this is a generation that really craves authenticity, perhaps more than anything else. Slide, please, Jess. So what does that mean in terms of how we lead them? Before, has that been more important? We need leaders who are truly authentic. No longer is it good enough just to talk the talk. To get the most out of this generation, you need to work hard to build an honest relationship built on trust and founded on a strong ethical base. And there is a need to create certainty through structure, through standards, through values that have real meaning and substance. People laugh at the first 5 weeks at Sandhurst where we do lots of drill, we do lots of inspections, cleaning. But you know what? Habit forming is really important. Sweating the small stuff, getting the basics right is important because it drives confidence. When you're faced with a difficult decision in a combat situation, when all is going wrong around you, the last thing you want to be doing is worrying about how you operate your weapons system, for example. And generating real confidence to encourage initiative and deal with setbacks needs us to create the safety net that allows a tolerance to make the occasional mistake. And that safety net I found is a learning culture which allows young people to be able to push themselves to the threshold of failure. And if they do fail, to learn from the experience and bounce back better. How do you stand in front of your team when you've lost 9 people killed? How do you pick yourself up, dust yourself down, and then inspire the remainder to get back in the fight? And it's also really important that we stress the importance of team. Generating teams or organizations that create a sense of belonging is really important. Giving them a structure which inculcates a sense of pride and generates those bonds of trust, belief in one another in particular. And because they're better connected and want to be part of the conversation, we've had to learn how to embrace diversity of thought. Generating teams where members feel that it's okay to speak up and say, there is a better way of doing this. Intelligent followership. Young Fusilier Humphreys, who after 3 nights of strike operations in Basra, picked up on the fact that we were actually settling family feuds rather than achieving any tactical effect. So it's about leaders who understand when to issue clear direction and when to allow freedom to unlock creativity by empowering their people to make decisions based on an understanding of intent, acting with disciplined initiative to be able to seize those fleeting opportunities that give us the opportunities. In the middle of an Afghan village during an intense firefight, when you know that your next action will have strategic consequences, there is literally no time to ask the boss. And it's about generating teams where leaders are able to retain responsibility and accountability for decisions, but are able to unlock the potential of their team so that individuals within the team feel confident to stand up and make the play if they feel they have the answer to the particular leadership challenge. Slide, please, Jess. So what does that mean for us, the leaders, in terms of how we therefore lead Generation Z? Again, these are just a few observations based on my experience and a few mistakes I've made along the way. I think the first thing is that we need to have regular check-ins on our own leadership. We need to be more self-aware. We can't just assume good leadership anymore. This is a generation that craves authenticity. Then we need to ensure we understand how they view us. And there are plenty of tools out there that can help us do that. And once we've checked in on our leadership, we've got to do something about it. We've got to close the blind spots or highlight the positives, coaching and mentoring. I'm embarrassed to say that the Army's only just picking up on this after generations. We should have been better at it. It's coming in, but if I had my way, it would have been in years ago, and it would have been across the rank structure. And with that self-awareness comes the need to constantly upskill. We need to ensure that we retain the competence that therefore allows us to retain the credibility in front of those that we lead. And for me, I'll admit, for me, it's mostly about IT. I'm rubbish at IT. My kids laugh at me at the fact that I can't even still work my smartphone. And it's not just a senior thing. In the recent crisis, when we had issues in our training establishments, we had to send over 4,000 youngsters back home whilst we reset the training engine for COVID compliance. We had to form virtual platoons that meant we could care for them, develop them, and look after them whilst they were at home. And we assumed wrongly that the generation of instructors, millennials mostly, were going to be able to do all this, that they were going to be comfortable, virtual leading. And we were wrong, and we needed to focus in on it. And I might come back to virtual leadership in questions. And finally, in terms of leading them, it's got to be, we need to understand how we communicate clearly. The how is just as important as the what, perhaps you could argue. The old-fashioned tomes of paper directives just don't hit it, as I know you all know. But as a CEO of an armoured infantry battalion, it took me a long time to understand that whilst I crafted these beautiful operation orders, beautifully worded, actually the person who was having to read them and make sense of them was a young leader bouncing around his Warrior armoured vehicle, viewing it over a screen this big. And the best thing I've done recently, the last couple of years, is get myself a reverse mentor. In my case, it's been a young female officer who's been able to advise me on the best way to make that all-important connection with my people. Slide, please, Jess. So that's me. And my final thought really takes us back to Sandhurst, an institution that has been developing leaders now since 1812, and an institution of which I am hugely proud. You know, generations of leaders have, in the most part, gone on to do exceptional things in the most difficult of environments. You know, whilst it's right that we adapt the way we lead to ensure that we deal not only with the increasing complexity of the environment in which we are, for which we are preparing them for, but also deal with the changing generations coming through. We need to be aware of the arrogance of the present.
Top down.
And perhaps now more than ever, as we emerge from lockdown with some great ideas about moving forward in the virtual space, we need to remember, you know, the enduring nature of leadership. You know, no matter how difficult the challenge, there'll always be a need, for example, for presence and for people who can inspire their people. There'll always be a need for more than walk amongst us, to provide an arm around the shoulder.
Please, can somebody please mute themselves? Sorry, I can't hear you. Can someone mute whoever's unmuted?
Okay, it's gone quiet now, so I presume that's it. Sorry about that. So yeah, it's about you know, retaining that enduring nature of leadership, because I think as my friend in the photograph that you can see hopefully there is about to demonstrate, you know, those last unforgiving seconds or meters, you know, men and women follow us not because of our rank or our position in the company, but they follow us because they believe in us as people. Okay, that's me. I'll hand back to Richard now. I think he's got a few questions for me. Richard.
Yeah, Paul, thank you very much. Some really interesting insights there. One of the topics that would be good to just explore with you a little bit more is that you mentioned the requirement to make sometimes very difficult decisions under pressure, and maybe relatively inexperienced and young leaders making these decisions. And it links to the concept of mission command, which again you touched on, which is really about asking leaders to work out the how and giving them the outcome that you want, rather than being very directive. And I'm quite passionate about this in a business context, because there is this misconception that the military, everything's very directive, and you give people instructions and they follow, and it's a very black and white way of leading. But of course, mission command is key to how the military lead and get good results. So it's about passing accountability downwards. So could you just expand a little bit on particularly how Generation Z cope with that and how it helps them to be effective, particularly from an angle of disciplined initiative, as you put it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think there is a time when people do need to be a directive. I think there is a time when people need to be told what to do. But there is also, when we're tackling some of these wicked problems, there is a real need to place authority to act at the point where the information is most available. And that's as I said in my brief bit, it's about seizing fleeting opportunity, and that's how you get ahead of the opposition, is by being quicker to react than them. And so that's why we've come up. Well, the Americans came up with it, but mission command, it's a philosophy that we try and drill into our people. And the example I talked about in the talk there, in the Afghan village, you know, this is an operation where we got intelligence that there were rockets in a place called Barigul Bazaar that were going to be fired at a place called Bastion, a big headquarters depot in Helmand in Afghanistan. So we had to put an operation in to go and sort it out. And it was a helicopter assault. Went in very early in the morning, and battalion-sized operation. But the point platoon, 30 men, and it was all men, was led by a young lieutenant, and he was first into the village and very quickly got into a firefight and started taking casualties. So he was faced with a really difficult decision, because a minibus came out towards him. His men fired upon it because they thought it was a bomb, and turned out to be civilians. So he had a civilian casualties issue. He had his own casualties. He knew there were rockets in the village. I had to make a decision: do I carry on, or do I pull back because I've had civilian casualties? And why I say that is because he had to make a decision on the spur of a moment but there were three things that enabled him to make the right decision. One was he understood the context of the environment he was in. He understood the context of the strategic environment as much as the tactical environment, because his actions were going to have strategic effect. So he knew at the time that President Obama was in negotiations with President Karzai about a bilateral security agreement, and that the hot topic at the moment was civilian casualties. So he knew that that was an issue. The second thing was he knew his commander's intent. So the commander had said to him, your mission is to disrupt the Taliban from firing those rockets. So he knew that actually just by the fact that he was in the village and in a firefight, he'd achieved the disrupt. And the third thing was that the commander had clearly articulated what risk he was prepared to take in that operation. So the youngster on the ground knew what risk his boss would accept, and he knew that he wouldn't accept civilian casualties. And therefore, all that allowed him to make a snap decision, and he ceased operations, he pulled his people back, and we disrupted the rockets, but we managed to achieve strategic effect. So that's just, I know it's a long-winded answer to your question, but that's why it's so important to create the conditions to allow young leaders in particular to seize opportunities. And it's as much about doing nothing as it is about doing something, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that point about clarity is key. And when we look at effective teams in a business context, we know from lots of studies that one of the factors, the key factor that leads to high performance is clarity at every level. And as you say, again, the military is very good at that, at cascading that clarity downwards, so that even the soldier on the front line really understands what the general's intent is, because it follows all the way through. Just on that point around developing the ability to make decisions under pressure, which is, I'm sure, a trait which all leaders would like, and certainly businesses would like their leaders to have that trait. How does Sandhurst actually go about developing the ability to make decisions like that, but also balancing leadership with followship? Because clearly both are important, and actually you could argue knowing how to work for others and how to support and enable them is as important as how to lead them.
Yeah, I think it's about encouraging diversity of thought and encouraging people to offer solutions. And it's about leaders who are not afraid to ask the team, anybody got a better way of doing this? It's about, it's not leading by committee, but it's about utilizing the power of the team to try and think through this. And it's about people not being afraid to, put their hand up and say there's a better way of doing this, or even step in when they know that the commander is making a bad decision. So I made a bad decision in the recent COVID crisis when I went down to a place called Pirbright and was being briefed by the team on how we were going to deal with a number of recruits who have been isolated because the strategic direction was to crack on for as long as possible. That's what I was going to do, and I was focused on that. And there was a young doctor who actually came up and he put his hand up and he said, "You know what? That's the wrong thing to do. We've got a certain amount of time now to make a decision to start getting these kids home to save that. If we don't, we're going to get overwhelmed, and you're not going to be able to deal with this in another 3-4 days. So we've got to act now." And had he not done that, had he not had the courage to stand up and say to me, "You're making a bad call here," we'd be in a really bad place. So it's how do you unlock that? And I think one of the best things we do at Sandhurst, and it goes back to this point about self-awareness, is that whenever they go out and they do a leadership task, when they come back off that task, the rest of the team debrief them through an app on their phone or their tablet, and that's thoughts of the team goes towards a debrief from the instructor, the colour sergeant, or the captain who debriefs them. And therefore you're getting this sense of, as a leader, actually I should have consulted with them because they had an answer or whatever it is. So you understand right from the get-go how important it is to reach into the team for direction sometimes.
I think it's interesting how you have to strike that balance between ultimately owning accountability for the outcome, but as you say, working in a very collaborative way, genuinely being participative and encouraging input and challenge, but still owning that final decision. So you're not shirking that.
Absolutely. People forget, particularly in the military, that whilst you are enabling authority to act, as the commander, the leader, ultimately you've got to retain the responsibility and the accountability. You can't pass that down to them, and that all comes with trust.
Yeah, many of our clients will be familiar with that, especially so over the last few years, given the focus on risk management and, of course, the ultimate owner of risk, even if you're quite a long way from where the management of that risk actually takes place.
Yeah, but explain to them, explain to them the risk that you're carrying. A clear articulation of what risk you are prepared to take is just as important as what risk you're not prepared to take. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you've got to give them the freedoms, because otherwise, you throw up a risk register, and they see it as a threat, whereas risk is sometimes an opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And related to that, you mentioned the need to allow people to fail in a safe and controlled way, ideally. Do you have some examples of the real world impact of this, where that culture of allowing testing and failing has actually led to better performance ultimately?
Yeah, I've got numerous. I mean, I think it's about how do you, and I'm sorry to talk about casualties, but I suppose that's ultimately for us, that's where we feel we failed the most. If we lose people or get people hurt, then you take it very personally as a leader, and therefore, bouncing back from that is difficult. And I remember in an operation in Iraq, a young section commander lost one of his fusiliers, and took it really hard. And without anybody prompting him, the concern he had was that he had made a bad call that resulted in a friendly fire incident, so that the young soldier was killed by another member of either his team or the team next to them as they were going through a compound. So what did he do? He wanted a bit of closure on it for himself, but also for his team, because he felt that they needed to draw a line under this before they move on. So what he did was he asked permission, but then he took them back over the ground. We went back out with them, and they walked the assault again, and they talked it through, and they sat down at the end. And I wasn't there, but I got it from someone else. They sat down at the end, and they all had a chat about it, and they said, right, it wasn't us. We didn't do this. It was enemy action. So, we did our best, and he's gone, and let's just drive on. That ability to pick yourself up, work out how is the best way for you, having that mental resilience to be able to drive on and get after it is hugely important. And I suspect it's the same in the civilian world as well. The stresses that you're all dealing with on a day-to-day basis, it's very similar to the stresses that we deal with. And it's about, you want resilient people who can get after it.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one final question before we move to questions from participants. And this actually relates to some of the questions that I've been seeing coming through. Could you give us a bit of insight into how the Army selects the next generation of leaders?
Yeah, well, firstly, we're very lucky that we can select based on leadership potential. That's what we do. I mean, I'm talking about officers now, and for Sandhurst, and we all go to Sandhurst. Every officer goes through Sandhurst, and therefore every officer goes through selection. And selection takes place at a place called Westbury, and it's an Army Officer Selection Board, and it runs for about 3.5 days. And there's a number of things they look at, but it's based on looking at personality, motivation, behaviours, but above all, character. And they have ways of, and they do physical tests as well, and mental tests, and quite a there's 12 dimensions that they go through, which I can't go through now. But it's a tried and tested system, and it works. And interestingly enough, I as commandant, we have a thing called a leadership development course. So we take risk. That's in the old days. If you fail, and I failed RCB as it was called in those days. I failed it first time, was told to go away and come back in a year's time when I'd grown up a bit. If we did that today, they wouldn't come back. This generation will go off and they'll do something else. And we lose talent. So we put together a thing called leadership development course. We took those ones that we knew had it, but just needed a bit more. We take them into Sandhurst. We ran a 12-week course that brought them up to the start state of the commissioning course. And all you ex-Army out there are screaming Royal and Company at me down the thing. It's not Royal and Company. It's different. It's about getting you to the start state for Sandhurst. And where they were failing is on character and confidence mainly. It's just having that confidence that you can do this, and therefore the leadership development course is based on developing character.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, because I think the Army's approach to selecting leaders and future leaders is in some ways the reverse of how businesses select leaders. So often they are identified as being great at what they do, on their technical expertise or their delivery capability, and they're promoted to lead teams. And not always does somebody have that conversation with them around, A, do they want it? Do they want to become a leader at this point in time? And B, what does that entail? What does good look like? What does high performance as a leader look like? And how does it differ to being the expert in the room? And so a lot of our work is supporting those leaders to be successful and to understand the differences between being a great leader of experts and being the expert. So it's very interesting that the military takes the opposite view, which is let's select on competence, character, potential, and we'll add the technical skills and expertise later on. That's the way the system's designed, so it's possibly easier than in a business context. But I think there's a bit of crossover there.
I think it is different, and I think we have the luxury of being able to do that.
Yeah.
I'm sure businesses do, but I'll be interested to hear. And I think the other thing that we got to make sure people understand is that Santos is not the be all and end all. Santos is just the start of the journey. And as we go through our careers, we're very fortunate that we can get these injects of leadership development as we go through to prepare us for the next level, the next rank, the next whatever it may be. Again, a luxury which I suspect not many businesses can afford, but hugely, leadership is not a one-stop shop. You've got to carry on developing it as you go, and that's, I think the Army has got that right. Dare I say it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it seems to be working well. Thank you again, Paul. Given the time, I'm going to hand over to Andrew just to take some questions from participants. So, Andrew, over to you.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you, and thank you everyone who's put some questions into the chat room. There's a lot of questions, so we won't have time to do all of them. And also, I'll try and merge some of them together because there are some themes that come on that are sort of centralising. This is from David James Roll, and it's probably quite appropriate for the time at the moment. As we emerge from COVID lockdown, companies are grappling with how to re-establish their culture, having had their employees dispersed and working from home. Does General Paul have any advice on building culture and re-establishing identity, especially after a virtual experience we've all had with COVID?
Great question. Do you know what we were wrestling as I left the Army 2 weeks ago, and my last job, I as well as Sandhurst, I also looked after the recruiting and training command. So we'd sent everybody home, and the headquarters have been working from home, same as you guys, and then we had to bring everybody back in gradually, except we didn't, because we didn't have to, and people got used to working from home, distributed working off the laptop. And actually we found that in terms of outputs, we were getting very similar in terms of when we were all together in the headquarters. However, around about the sort of 2.5 month point, and bear in mind we're partnered with Capita, so we're working civvies and military together. The niggles started to sneak in, and people who had great relationships were starting to get a bit strained, and we were trying to put our finger on it. And it was all about the fact that, this is a different way of working and we're not really used to it. So, there are going to be some strains on relationships when you can't do that face to face, and you can't, get yourself in a room and smash through some ideas. So we were thinking about, how are we going to do this? How are we going to bring everybody back in? And do you know what? It sounds really flippant, but we decided what we needed was a good old fashioned company smoker, or by a company smoker, what I mean by that is it's effectively a party where everybody can just come together and just get to know one another again, and prod one another in the chest. And I know it's difficult to do in COVID compliant land, but I think that's what we need. And my advice to you is you need to have some sort of team building, bonding session that gets people back into the team, because that's what they've been missing. It's those relationships that can only be built, around the table, or in the breakout room, wherever it may be. It may be too much of a flippant answer, and I apologise if it is, James, but that's I think would be my advice. Some sort of thing to remind them of the team that they are part of. gone quiet.
Yeah, there we go. Sorry. Classic rookie on Zoom. Had this up on mute there.
You already are, sorry, Andrew, as well, weren't you?
Right, again, this is slightly amalgamated question because on the subject of Generation Z, generally, I'm summarising a little bit. A lot of people say at Sandhurst, you deal with people who are pre-selected, who are very capable and have gone through like that, some sort of pre-selection, i.e. sort of the top performers. What's your thoughts on, and maybe it's a question both for Richard and Paul, but your thoughts on working with people who are not, in the sort of top tier of everything? And equally, as a sort of subtext of that is often those individuals seem much harder to lead and motivate. And I'm quoting out of Clive Banks here. It's quite specific, but does do they have a sense of entitlement of Generation Z, and how, as a leader, do you kind of overcome that?
Well, I think. Sorry, who asked that question?
Well, that's an amalgamation, but Clive Banks was the one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point. There's a sort of misconduct. Everyone believes that Sandhurst is all we get is the privileged, public school educated, Oxford, Cambridge, who are slightly elitist. It's just absolutely not the case, and it hasn't been for many years. But there's no judge on high achievers. If you want a metric, I can give you a metric. 70% of the last cohort coming through came from a state school education. So 70% of them come from state school, if that's any metric at all. I don't believe it is nowadays, but there you go. What we're finding, though, is that this generation, doesn't matter where they come from, have some gaps in their knowledge, in their life skills that we, in days gone by, we assumed they would have had. So, for example, that ability to stand up on your 2 feet and communicate with a group of people, over 70% of them have never had that opportunity. They've just not been able to do that, not because they can't, but because they just never had the opportunity. So that's why we've had to develop that at Sandhurst and bring, we've had to develop part of the academic department now is the Centre for Applied Behavioural Sciences. It's about, we have to teach emotional intelligence now. We teach mindfulness to deal with resilience. There's things that we are having to teach that days gone by they would have had through other means. So, Clive, I don't think it's. I think we're dealing with the same sort of talent that you are. Yes, we can select them, but even through the selection process, we are having to make some, take some risk on some of the traits they would have had.
And I'd also say as well that just on the point about working with very high performing individuals. Yes, by the time somebody starts Sandhurst, they've gone through a rigorous selection process and they have effectively been screened for their potential. But that isn't that different to the way that, for example, we work with clients to help them assess potential amongst their leaders to say, let's assess that. Let's really understand, do they have the will to step up and do more? Do they have the potential to do it? And if they do, then let's invest in them, let's support them, let's work with them in the same way that Sandhurst does. So there are those gateway points, and I think it's fair to say that by the time people get to Sandhurst, they have been rigorously assessed and filtered. But there are absolutely ways of doing that in business as well, so that you're working with the top potential leaders, and clearly other groups need support too.
Okay, in the interest of sound like one of the sort of BBC people, I need to get your answers a little bit briefer because we've got a lot of questions coming in. Okay. Now this question is from Clarissa Farr. Thanks, Clarissa. Her question is this: you mentioned reverse mentoring. How did that work, and what were the key takeaways for Paul from his reverse mentor?
It works that I asked for someone outside of my chain of command. So it was a female in my case. So I didn't know her. I didn't know of her. She was picked for me by an organisation, the Centre for Army Leadership, who put out the word that I was looking for a reverse mentor if anyone wanted to volunteer. She came forward and she spoke to me once a month, and I was able to ask her advice on how particularly to communicate. So, for example, I put out a regimental strategy and I gave it to her, and she said she played with it and gave it back to me and turned it into something that actually a Fusilier would understand. So that's how I used her.
Okay, great stuff. Now this one is it's from Steve Croucher from Morningstar. I'd be interested to understand Paul's view on how the Army have incorporated diversity and inclusion into their recruitment process.
Yeah, very good question. And the answer is not particularly well so far. We need to do better, mainly because we're missing out on a lot of talent by not getting, and it's females, 12% of Sandhurst are females. We should be much, much better than that. And of course, there's also the BAME dimension as well. So we are getting after it. I think two things to be quick. One is changing culture within the Army, and goes back to my point on self-awareness. And I've been through it myself, my diversity and inclusion leadership courses, where I think I know it all, and I find that I've got a lot of unconscious bias that I need to sort myself out on. So the self-awareness of cultural change. And then we've got to make the offer more appropriate. And if I talk about females, for example, there is a lot of fear out there about joining what is seen predominantly as a male environment. We've got to change the way we get the offer out there to make sure that it appeals to females, to make sure that they understand that, they can compete with their males. It's not all about fizz. It's a lot about, your leadership potential. So we've got to change the offer, but first and foremost, we've got to get the culture right.
Yeah, and just on that one, the other sort of side of it, I think we're seeing a lot of focus on what was originally diversity around the female-male ratios. In recent times, the Black Lives Matter, racial justice, and so on, I think many organisations are also having to step up their culture around that aspect as well, by diversity side. Okay, good. Right, so James Harrison, I'll read this out, it's a bit long one, so bear with me. Individuals in businesses are often promoted as a result of successful management and not the demonstration of effective leadership characteristics. What advice would you give to organisations to recognise the leadership capabilities of Generation Z and therefore ensure they're best positioned for growth and promotion? So I guess it's management versus leadership, I guess, is these in a nutshell. And how do you then sort of get the young guys coming through, guys and girls coming through for that?
Good question. And I'm not entirely convinced we are as good at that as we perhaps think. I'm not entirely convinced we yet in the Army have a really good way of rewarding and measuring leadership. A lot of our promotion is done on performance, you could argue, but that's a different problem. I think in terms of an organisation, there's a lot to be said for awareness tools in a 360 degree. Marking your leadership can only be done by your peers, you could argue, and therefore having that as part of the process is quite useful. I would just say that there is a danger there that if you link it to formal evaluation, it sort of goes against the grain somewhat, because it's about self-awareness. But I think there's got to be some way of picking up people who are struggling as leaders, failing as leaders, and being able to identify them. And if they don't improve, then you've got to step in and do something about it. Give them the opportunity to improve themselves. But if they don't, then you've got to step in and do something about it. And conversely, if they're doing really well, then of course you can reward them, be that promotion or whatever. So I think self-awareness tools, there's a lot of them out there. There's some really good ones, there's some poor ones, but find the right one and applying it would be my advice.
I think it's also, Andrew, about being very clear about what good leadership looks like in a specific organisation, and that can vary quite a lot. The Army, for example, is very good at defining the values and standards that are expected from all ranks and reinforcing that from day one of training all the way through somebody's career. So that's very much about how you behave and how you lead, not just what you do and the results that you deliver. So I think having a very clear definition of what good leadership looks like and continually reinforcing that really helps.
Yeah, and one thing we pulled in the last couple of years was a thing called the Leadership Code, which helps translate the values that we sign up to as Army leaders into behaviours. And it serves as a checklist to sort of mark your leadership. It's really, really useful, and it's quite good at driving culture.
Good stuff. Okay, it's from Dmitry Bagrov. Hi, Paul. Very interesting. Thank you. Simon Sinek uses virtually the same words to describe millennials, brackets, instant gratification, lack of friendship skills, etc. Perhaps we are talking about young people in general here and not something generational, question mark.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I said at the beginning, I wasn't picking on Generation Z for any other reason than they're the generation coming through at the moment, and therefore it seemed like an obvious cohort to go at. You know, the eldest of them, 25 now. So at Sandhurst, the average age 23. I've been watching them come through for the last 5 years, so I know more about this generation than perhaps four. Of course, there will be characteristics that apply to all generations, and I'm sure millennials, as I alluded to when I talked about the instructors who are millennials, have similar traits. They also have different traits, and I think, you know, the message is it's not about you. You just got to adapt. You've got to adapt the way you lead to deal with whatever cohort's coming through. It doesn't matter what generation, but they will all be slightly different. You just got to keep adapting the way you lead. What you can't do is think that one size fits all, and that's really the message of this.
Okay, good. And a message for both of you, from Andrew Pullman. What are the key leadership lessons that you observed from the COVID crisis at home and abroad? Richard, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, when I think about one of the most common conversations we're having with clients, particularly from a leadership perspective, is around the level of support and self-care that leaders need and want. So leaders have found themselves obviously remote. They're in a situation that no one's been in before. And there's a lot of expectation and weight on their shoulders. So they're expected to have the answers for their teams. They're expected to role model a positive outlook about the future of the business and the individuals within their teams. And they don't necessarily have all the answers. So I think what we're finding is they're benefiting greatly from having either a reverse mentor or a coach or somebody they can share that experience with to sort of relieve the pressure a bit and just reflect on their experience to date, discuss options in a safe environment, and just really understand how other leaders are approaching it as well. They're not becoming too downward focused, but continuing to look upwards and outwards. So I think I always use the analogy of high performing sports people. You'd rarely find one without a coach or a mentor or somebody else to guide them and provide a bit of reflection. And that's what we're finding is an increased need given the situation we've got around remote working. Just that level of support for leaders so they can look after themselves and lead in the most effective way.
I think that's a really good point. I'd add two things. What on a negative, we struggle with the concept of virtual leadership, trying to make sure that people understood that even though people are distributed and spread up around the place and you're dealing with them through a screen, you still got to be able to inspire and be able to lead them the same way as you would do if they were in the same room. So that was a negative, and we had to get around that. And we're still working on that, and I think it's going to be something that we're going to have to think about as we go forward when this becomes more of the norm. And then the second on the positive was we were able to flatten the command structure through an all-informed net. And what do I mean by that? So every morning, when at the height of the crisis, we'd have what we call a stand-up, where people would be able to dial in, we'd be able to communicate to everybody. We had upwards of 200 people every morning listening to what was going on, getting that context. And that genuinely did unlock initiative. And low-level initiative was the way we could get ourselves through that COVID crisis, because it was bottom up as well as top down that was helping us get through it.
But I guess that depends on having the right culture and senior leaders who are genuinely willing to listen to those ideas and incorporate them into the plans.
Yeah.
Okay, great stuff. Natasha Ryan has written in, like a DJ, don't I now? Thank you, Paul, for your time and sharing. You mentioned the importance of authenticity as a conduit to build and retain trust and instilling a culture with strong ethics. How do you balance authenticity with the need for agility? E.g., we find change in strategy and focus is common in the technology sector.
Authenticity.
Well, how do you make sure your leadership strategy has the agility to react and adapt?
I don't link the two together. I think being authentic is about creating the bonds of trust that allow you to unlock the ability to drive innovation and allow people that freedoms to operate because they know they've got their backs. I would say authenticity drives the ability to innovate. I may be missing the point, but I think all we talked about in the previous question about senior leaders who can unlock low-level leadership to be able to get after problems and not wait for answers, get after it, absolutely relies on trust. Everything goes back to trust. If you think that if I'm going to drop the ball and make a mistake here, my boss is going to fire me or is going to punish me in some way, you ain't going to go out there and do some innovation. But if you know that a boss is a good bloke and I've seen him or her, and I know him or her, and I believe in them, so I'm going to push the boundaries for them, and I'm going to go for it because I know I'm going to be covered. Surely that's got to be the way it's got to work culturally. I don't know if well, Natasha can't come back, but I don't know if I've answered the question. But Richard, you got anything?
Well, I'd agree. I think it does come down to trust, because if I trust the person I'm working with and for, and they come to me and say, that was our strategy last week, everything's got to change because of the context, I will be more likely to go with them and support them and enable them if I trust them and understand them through authentic leadership than if I don't, so where I might disengage. So I completely agree. It comes back that I think one leads to the other.
Good. Okay. Anthony Townsend has asked, what steps can I take to stand out as a leader within my organisation in order to move into a senior manager position? And I guess perhaps there's a sort of subtext or sub-question there is, I know it's a hard one to pin down, but if you had to sort of name 3 or 4 characteristics of a good leader. So Anthony's asking about how you can move up the organisation, how can you demonstrate leadership, but also what are the qualities of a leader? I know this is a massive topic, but you've got 20 seconds.
Okay. Well, two things. One is focus on the here and now. I do see people who come into a role or a rank and immediately looking at the next rank, and I think that's dangerous. The best advice I was given was treat this job as your last in the army. Put 100% into it, and the rest will take care of itself. And the second one is honesty. I think you've got to be honest and straight with your people. And in this day and age in particular, with all the stresses and strains we're all under, just being straight with them and leveling with them, again, builds that trust, which is all important. And I think if you have that honest relationship with your people, they'll work for you, and your bosses will see that. And hopefully that will be rewarded by them putting you into more responsible positions. Over.
Yeah, I've got 4 very quick things off the top of my head, but based on experience. One is demonstrate initiative. Don't just do what you're asked to do, but think beyond that as well. Demonstrate a strong appetite for learning, because that's a key indicator of high potential. Demonstrate a broad perspective and that you understand the context, and also build relationships, not just with the people that you need to build them with, but with lots of other people who may prove useful later on.
Okay, brilliant. Now, unfortunately, it's 11:24. We did try and sort of say we'd try and keep reference to time. We can always keep this thing going open for questions afterwards, but I'd like just to maybe pause on the general Q&A and ask Paul and Richard perhaps to do some summarising of what we've discussed today, in order that those who need to move on can do. And like I say, we will keep some questions open afterwards, but Paul and Richard, maybe Paul first, just to summarise a little bit of, I guess, not so much what your presentation was about, but also perhaps some reflection on some of the questions and the general tone of the session today.
Yeah, I'm a bit worried that, well, as I said at the beginning, quite controversial, and obviously, hopefully people don't think I'm picking on Generation Z. I am absolutely not. The most oft asked question I got in my time at Sandhurst from a variety of audiences was, is this generation, are these cadets, these young officers coming through now, as good as what's come before? And the answer is 100% yes. They are incredibly talented, probably more talented than certainly than I ever was. It's just that I think we have to have our eyes open in terms of, if we're going to get the most out of their potential, then we've got to think about how we adapt our own leadership styles to be able to do that. And that hopefully is the theme and the message that I'm trying to get across today.
Yeah, and all I'd say to close off, Andrew, is that we appreciate that there are some big differences between the military context and business context and leading in those two different scenarios. But of course, I think there are a lot of similarities as well. And there are certainly lots of very positive military leadership traits and approaches that map well into the business world. For example, businesses can focus on character and behavior as a core to high performance leadership, above skills and expertise. And clearly there'll be a balance between the two. And senior leaders can also do more often to leverage the expertise of their teams and to genuinely listen to them and trust them and involve them. So there are lots of lessons and approaches that can be learned, and I think equally the military can learn a lot from business as well, and that's certainly happening with coaching, mentoring, and many other areas. But Paul, thank you very much. We sincerely appreciate your time and effort in putting together your presentation and to answering so many questions. At this point, given the time, I'm going to hand over to Andrew just to close the event.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'm just looking at the on the message board. A lot of people I'm just having to log off, so we'll start drawing to an end now. So thank you everyone for your time. We hope it's obviously interesting and informative. We will send you a feedback survey. I'm very grateful for your comments, and we'll also send you a link to a recording of this session. Lastly, on behalf of Hanover, but thank you very much to General Nanson for your time and insight. Really appreciate it. And generally, look, we welcome the opportunity to have a follow-up discussion with each and every one of you about your organisation and maybe how we can help you. So please, as at the beginning of the call, we're not an events company, we're a talent company. So allow us to that sort of, we may come back to you. Thank you very much, and I hope the rest of your day goes well.